Hi, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. Delighted to be here in Manila at the start of the Partnerships and Careers Forum. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our very first guest this morning, Stephen Groff, who is, of course, the Vice President of Operations at the Asian Development Bank, somebody who I've known for years, and I think many DevX members know for years from your prior incarnations at the MCC and the OECD and a long storied career in development. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Raj.
And you're one of our morning panelists. We're going to be talking in the plenary this morning about the key issue around partnerships, which is localization. So this idea that historically in development, the money, the influence, the decisions came from places like Washington and London and Tokyo, and now increasingly those decisions and that funding is flowing to the local level. Countries, particularly in Asia, given the rapid economic growth here, are taking more and more ownership of their own development. And what are the practical implications around that? It's something we're going to be discussing this morning. You've been in this field a long, long time. You've been in the Philippines over many, many decades, different times in your career. What is your kind of broad perspective about this issue?
Well, I think that indeed this is happening, and it is, but it's not new in any sense. I mean, in particular, when you think about it in the context of Asia, I mean, Asia has been growing rapidly for many decades now. Asia has become much more confident in itself, and that's not just something that's happened over the last couple of years. That's something that's been happening over the last couple of decades. And so really this move towards focusing on capacity at a local level, focusing on capacity within a country as opposed to having to import that capacity or that expertise is something that we at the Asian Development Bank have been dealing with for the last really 15, 20 years. And it expresses itself in a number of different ways, but largely, if you look at the way that we engage with our countries, it's very much, they lead the discussion. They identify what their priorities are, and we come in and help support that in any way that is appropriate or in any way that we feel that we can add some expertise and some experience.
And I think that's particularly the case given your business model, like other multilateral development banks where you're providing lending facilities. So the governments are taking a loan, and of course they're going to own that to a greater degree than they may have if it were grant funding. I think the bilateral agencies are maybe now getting a little bit more active in this idea. So what do you say, coming from your ADB seat, to those bilateral agencies, foundations, NGOs that are a little bit newer to this, and that have these concerns around how do we practically send funding directly to the local level, engage local organizations? There's some real practical issues there. What are your views around it?
Well, I mean, I'm probably a little bit biased given my experience at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and in its infancy, and I do really think that those priorities, I mean, any development assistance or development project to be successful has to be owned by a community, by a group of people, by a government, and the only way that that's going to be owned if it's identified by them as a priority. And so that's why I really do think it's critically important that you find a way of engaging that community, that group of people, that government in a process of identifying what those priorities are and in a process of identifying, as part of those priorities, what are the interventions you're going to do to address those needs. And that's, of course, something that the Millennium Challenge Corporation was set up to do, and it is very much a way that the multilateral development banks operate. Now, that's not to say that there isn't any need for advice and guidance that's more supply-driven, because sometimes a country doesn't necessarily know, or a community doesn't necessarily know, all of that which is available that could answer their priorities. But there has to be a back and forth, there has to be a discussion.
Yeah, and I think given, as you said, the decades of economic growth here, one of the challenges for the multilateral banks is that now there's other sources of financing. And so coming in and trying to help develop the governance, the procurement systems, the sort of right approach to these issues, environmental safeguards and the like, there isn't just one game in town anymore.
Right.
How do you see that environment and dynamic changing at the ADB?
Well, I think that it's, I mean, certainly there's a demand within the region for different types of instruments and different types of support. Right. I mean, if you look at the need for infrastructure investment in Asia as a whole, developing Asia as a whole, it's about $8 trillion between now and 2020. Okay. So it's, for us to look microscopically at whether our relatively modest amount of money at $15 billion a year is going to service all the needs for Asia is foolish. So there is a huge need for us to be thinking about how do we crowd in as much finance and as much investment as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there does have to be, in order for that to be sustainable, in order for that investment to actually have the impact you want it to have, these kinds of safeguards, both financial and social and environmental, are critically important. And the countries themselves, while there is a cost to those types of safeguards, either in time or in money, the countries themselves are beginning to recognize how important that is. And I think that if you look at the risks that many of these countries face with respect to climate change, with the risks they face with respect to natural disasters, the environmental pollution that we've seen and it exhibit itself in many, many different cities across the region, countries are beginning to recognize how critically important these kinds of safeguards are, because it's going to help insulate them from those kinds of problems down the road.
Yeah, in a way, the development finance is the smart money in this game. You know, you can get money from lots of sources, but you want the smart money to help direct these investments to actually change the trajectory of the country.
No, indeed.
I wonder just for a minute if we could talk about Myanmar. I know you spent a lot of time there. They are earlier, much earlier in their development stage because of been isolated for so long. Now that they're opening up, there's lots of development aid flowing into the country. How do you deal in a country like that where capacity is so low? It's growing, there's commitment to grow it, but it starts at a pretty low point. How do you address these kinds of issues of localization there versus a place like the Philippines, which is obviously much further along?
Well, you have to take an approach that understands and appreciates what the strengths and the weaknesses are in any given situation.
Sure.
And even in a country like the Philippines, where there is tremendous capacity across the board, there are areas where they're going to need support, from experts that we can supply or experts that can be supplied by other countries. Even more importantly. And it's the same in Myanmar. The strengths are fewer, to be totally honest, but it's because of the history of that country and the development status of that country at the moment. But there is an incredible momentum, I think, behind the reform process we're seeing in Myanmar. There's an incredible dedication on the part of a core group of government officials in that country and political figures in that country and civil society in that country and business in that country. So we're quite optimistic that Myanmar will continue on this path. It's fraught with challenges, and it's going to take a long time. But we do think that they're on the right path, and they're going to continue to head in that direction.
And what about the path for Asia in general? ADB has the Strategy 2020. You're looking at an Asia that is rising in a big way and all the changes that that's going to mean for development. Just as we wrap up here, I'm curious, are you optimistic? Do you see trends heading in the right direction as we move toward 2020? How is the strategy working?
Well, we think that we are broadly optimistic about the future of this region. There are a lot of challenges. Inequality is a huge challenge in this region, and growing inequality is a bigger challenge. So there needs to be, alongside these investments in infrastructure, which are the need for which is dramatic, we have to see concurrent investments in education and health and social protection that are going to help reduce inequality, help build a more stable base for sustainable growth in the long run. We think that can happen, but it's going to take time. And the Asian Development Bank is also in the process itself of adjusting how we engage and adjusting how we look forward. We're in a region where by 2020 we're going to have 2 low-income countries left. The rest of the countries will be middle-income countries. And so that means that the kind of engagement we have has to adjust. And we've just completed a midterm review of our Strategy 2020 that you noted, which is our long-term strategic framework. And essentially that gives us a bit of some guidelines that we're going to follow going forward in making sure that we continue to be relevant to these countries and that we're responsive to their needs.
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot happening. It's a dynamic region. We're going to dig into more of this today on the panel. Thank you for being a part of this.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Raj.
Thank you.